I will be taking you through today's event along with my colleague Steve Clemens, the Washington editor-at-large. As James Bennett, our editor-in-chief, said earlier, we have an incredible lineup today. We're privileged to be talking to people who write about the economy and also people who are shaping the economy and the way that Americans live. Case in point, our next guest is Julián Castro, Secretary of Housing and Urban Development. He served 3 terms as mayor of San Antonio, and his political career began when he was elected to the city council at 26 years old. He was the youngest member of the council in the city's history. He's going to talk to my colleague, Matt Thompson, about the changing mission of HUD and the future of American housing. Over to you, Matt.
Good morning, and thank you for sitting down with us this morning, Secretary Castro.
Thank you for having me. Good morning, y'all. How are you?
So I noticed there's something of a journalistic distortion field around you, where it's like Clark Kent's glasses. Journalists see you these days, and all they see is vice presidential prospects. So I am not going to ask any questions about beat prospects, but I will try to leave a few minutes at the end of our Q&A for an audience question.
Well, you know, I thought that I had that in the bag, and then I, set myself with a picture with that in the background, the Coke industry, so I think it's done. Y'all can count on me not getting that. I'm just kidding.
So, homeownership has been a big theme of your approach. You've talked about removing the stigma of homeownership, around homeownership since the mortgage crisis. And, there were a lot of particularly Black and Latino homeowners whose assets were wiped out during the mortgage crisis. Some would argue that a house isn't undifferentiated. It's a not particularly diverse asset portfolio. It hampers workforce mobility. Make the argument for me. Homeownership, really, after the mortgage crisis.
Yeah, on September 16th of last year, I had the chance to give one of my first significant speeches as HUD Secretary. I'd been on the job about 2 months. And what I said was that we needed to remove the stigma of promoting homeownership, because throughout American history, homeownership really has been the cornerstone of the American dream. And that it's true that a few years ago, it was too easy to get a home loan. And because of that and other factors, we had a housing crisis. And since that time, though, what we've done is that we have put significant safeguards in place. What we've done with Dodd-Frank, what we've done with the qualified mortgage, adjustments that we have made at FHA, even though I will note that FHA was never a part of the problem in the way that folks often lump it in with other actors. And last year, for instance, of loans sold to the GSEs, the average credit score was 750. So my point was that it was too easy a few years ago to get a home loan. Today, it's too difficult out there for hardworking Americans who are middle class or people of modest means who in the past, and I'm not talking about in the run-up to the problem, but let's say 15 years ago, 20 years ago, would have been able to walk into a bank and get a home loan, just cannot do that today. So what we need is we need to be in the strong middle where we preserve those safeguards, but we also allow good access to credit. And your question is, well, why? And that's because home ownership has always been the most significant wealth creator for folks in the United States. So you mentioned, for instance, the African American and Hispanic communities. As much as we know about the differences in terms of income gaps there, the biggest gap is really a wealth gap that exists. I think the latest number that I saw was the distinction between the non-Hispanic white wealth and African American wealth was something like 22 to 1, a number that is truly shocking. And for most Americans, their wealth is located in the home that they own. It also means that the next generation is going to be in better stead because that's something that you're actually able to pass on instead of being a renter your entire life. Not that, as the housing secretary, I know fully well that there is a value in a strong rental market, and that has its place, but there's also a strong value in owning a home.
Now, some would also argue, so you're not the only one that's bullish on homeownership, and HUD is not the only one. Tax policy is also quite bullish on homeownership. Sure. Some would say that that the large tax subsidy for homeownership is sort of somewhat regressive. And how would you answer that argument?
Well, I think that that over the years there has been a benefit to the tax policy that we have. It has encouraged homeownership, and this is part of a discussion that Congress is likely to have about tax reform. I do see still a value there. I do think that that needs to be addressed in terms of, is there a better way to get a balance there? I saw that particularly in states, for instance, that have no income tax, like Texas, where I came from, but you're able to deduct your mortgage, so you have no state income tax, and you can often end up not paying any or hardly any federal income tax because of that. It's a legitimate question, but I do think that we can find a balance in those tax reform efforts.
So HUD is in an interesting place, particularly around affordable housing in its portfolio, because tax policy has a significant effect on homeownership, obviously, and affordability of housing. City municipal policy also has an extraordinary effect. Where do you think HUD has the most impact amidst those two, federal policy and city zoning policies?
It depends what program area at HUD that you're talking about. I think that we have a tremendous impact at the local level with some of our bread and butter programs like CDBG and HOME that give local governments tremendous flexibility to be able to create new housing stock or invest in things as simple as sidewalks and other infrastructure investments. At the same time, we have a very strong relationship with state governments, for instance, through CDBG and other programs and through the Treasury's work on LIHTC that is often combined with funds from HUD to make affordable housing possible. But the biggest relationship we have is not with city governments or state governments, it's really with local housing authorities. Because through our voucher programs, through traditional public housing, that serves millions of Americans. Outside of the FHA space, I think of the other program areas, that is the biggest impact that HUD makes. We see in cities across the United States today thousands and thousands of people on waiting lists for public housing and for vouchers. We see folks who are spending more than 30% of their income on rent. I believe it's almost half of the households in the United States now who are renters. So HUD has a role at every level of government, but most primarily with those local actors and specifically with our grantees who are housing authorities.
So HUD celebrates its 50th birthday this year, is that right?
50 years, yeah, 50 years old.
And housing and discrimination in housing has changed quite a bit from the 60s when HUD was chartered.
No doubt, yeah, well, changed for the better, and there was a time when entities like the FHA used to be part of the problem, right. With redlining. Then we got the Fair Housing Act of 1968, and since that time, HUD and the FHA have been on the right side of that, trying to improve the ability of anybody, no matter what the color of their skin is, or if they have a disability, or no matter what nation they come from, what religion they're from, that they can walk into a place and get treated the same way when they're looking for a home or looking for a rental.
Housing and equity in housing has been one of the big sort of structural issues. If you are a faithful reader of The Atlantic, you are no doubt familiar with Ta-Nehisi Coates' cover story, The Case for Reparations, which pointed to housing discrimination and redlining as being some of the root causes of inequities that are still playing out today. But I'm particularly curious about a study that HUD does about once a decade, and most recently did 2 years ago, about to try to figure out how much discrimination was going on. If you would describe the study, I would.
Yeah, so this is we've done many analyses over the years at HUD through our Fair Housing Office to try and gauge the level of housing discrimination out there. And this study that you mentioned was done in 2013, and it uses pairs of testers, essentially non-Hispanic whites and then members of a minority group, and tests with the same listing agent or landlord what the reaction is to that, couple A versus couple B that are in similar economic circumstances, present as pretty much the same except for their background. And what that study found was that African Americans were 12% less likely to be shown a unit, or saw 12% less units, that Hispanics were shown 11%, and that Asian Americans were shown 10% less than non-Hispanic whites. And so you start to get a sense of, at least through this one study, what the level of discrimination out there still is. This one was in the rental market that I'm speaking to specifically, but we have done ones as well that take a look at the purchase market. And it's just a reminder that even though we have made tremendous progress since 1968 and the Fair Housing Act, that we still have work to do.
What was interesting to me about this study is if you're an individual walking into a place and asking to be shown a set of properties, you'd have no idea. Everyone was treated courteously. All the testers said that they were treated with respect and courtesy. And far from the early 60s when you might have actually seen a Negroes Need Not Apply sign, you would not see that today. You would be treated respectfully. You'd just be shown fewer properties or offered different prices. How do you enforce fair housing and enforce against housing discrimination with that shifted approach to discrimination?
Yeah, I mean, you're right that it is much more difficult because you don't have the outward signs of discrimination. That's not always the case. In fact, just today there's news about a case that we filed against a gentleman in Minneapolis for discrimination against someone who is Hmong and who made comments that they wouldn't be rented to because of their language difficulty. And so sometimes it still is overt. Over the last 5 years, we took in 40,000 complaints, fair housing complaints, that resulted in $105 million in settlements. And in 2014, it was $26 million just in that 1 year. So, we have a hotline where folks can call their local fair housing office or the national one. You're right that it's still more difficult, it's now more difficult to identify, but obviously people are identifying the problem. And in some of those instances, it is warranted. And because of that, we've seen settlements that have been significant over the last few years.
I have been attending in recent days to a sort of parable that's been unfolding, or at least I read it as a parable that's been unfolding in New York, of this a housing development that has 55 that made available, a significant housing development in a fancy, nice neighborhood that made available 55 affordable spots for potentially lower income residents. 88,000 people have put in applications for those 55 slots. What are we to take away from that? What does that tell us about the state of housing?
Well, as I mentioned earlier with the waiting list, what we ought to take away from it is just the tremendous amount of need that there is out there for more affordable housing. And the fact is, as you all know, and you're going to be hearing in different contexts throughout the day, that the federal government obviously cannot address all of that. And so it's going to take stronger leveraging of the resources that we do have, and it's going to take more active local government as well. That's why in New York, I think one of the positive things is that there's not been a mayor in the last 10 years who's been more active on this issue, even though he's had a short tenure so far, than Mayor de Blasio, with a plan to create tens of thousands of new affordable housing units. That 88,000 person application pool is one signifier that you have a tremendous amount of demand for affordable housing. The other thing that was interesting about that, if I read it correctly the other day, was that this was a pour door building. You know, we've had this issue with pour doors, where affordable housing developers will develop affordable housing, but they'll create a community within a community that doesn't have access to the swimming pool or doesn't have access to other amenities, and literally oftentimes will have a different door that the subsidized residents will go in and out of instead of the main entrance. And that has been met with, I think, justifiable disapproval, but under law you can still do that. Even for that kind of development, you see that 88,000 people apply for 55 slots. That's how much demand there is. So my last point would be that at the local level, what we're encouraging communities to do is to look at things like including in their bond packages, when they run bond packages, a portion of that bond money that is set aside to leverage other dollars to create more affordable housing. That's something that a few cities like Austin, Texas, and a couple of others have done, but that has not caught on to the extent that I think it can. And hopefully we'll see more of that, as we've seen with Mayor de Blasio in New York.
I think we might have time for one question. No questions. All right. I've taken all Veep Stakes questions off the table. Thank you very much for sitting down.
Thanks a lot, y'all.